It is a network of international non-governmental organizations whose main agenda is to protect children in war zones. Through meticulous research exercises, they collect and collate data regarding violations against children around the globe. It is their mission to pressurize strategic key decision makers at the United Nations Security Council, recommending changes in policies and also the eventual implementation of global child protection policies. WatchList on Children and Armed Conflict recently produced an almost 70-page, strictly embargoed press release entitled "Who Will Care for Us?" based on their 6 weeks of intensive research on what they term grave violations against children in the northeastern parts of Nigeria. To help break down this release with us is Miss Janine Morna, who is from the WatchList Research Officer. Janine was a research fellow in the Children's Rights Division of the Human Rights Watch, where she investigated child labor. Janine Morna holds a Juris Doctor from Columbia Law School and a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Yale University. Janine joins me live here in the studio. Janine, welcome to Sahara TV.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so that was a brief description of exactly what your guys' organization, WatchList, does, and also what you have done in the past. But just to give us a brief, rundown of exactly what you do, can you explain to us what WatchList is all about?
Okay. So WatchList is a research and advocacy organization. We're actually a network organization, so we're made up of a number of international and domestic NGOs who work together to shed light on violations against children. We focus very specifically on something called grave violations. These are 6 specific violations against children, which are monitored by the UN and which are understood to be international human rights and humanitarian violations. In my capacity as research officer, I try to collect first-hand testimony and information about these issues in different areas. Okay, so I know that today you just actually released this press release of you presented actually at the United Nations Security Council. So you picked Nigeria, and we all know that sometime in April, 234 girls were kidnapped from a school in Chibok, and this is in line with the work that you guys are doing. So can you briefly describe to us when you moved into Nigeria and how you operated from there? So the reason we chose to focus on Nigeria is up until the time that the girls had been abducted, it really was a bit of a black box. A lot of the UN actors that we spoke to, a lot of international actors, domestic actors as well, just expressed a lot of concern about the fact that there wasn't a lot of documentation or information coming out of the Northeast about what had been happening to children. And we thought that this would be an important part of providing useful information for key actors to take action, to develop programs to better support children in those areas. There have been a lot of sporadic reports about violations in that area, but nothing that kind of comprehensively paints a picture of what's been taking place. So that was the reason we initially went in. Obviously, during that research period, there was this mass abduction, and the focus on Nigeria has definitely amplified since then. But yeah, that's kind of what initially led us to do the research, and we worked in partnership with local organizations to travel around different parts of Nigeria and collect this information and testimony. Okay, so when we talk about northeastern Nigeria, we're talking about the Adamawa State, we're talking of Borno State, we're also talking of Yobe State. This is where most of this action has been really going down. So now, you made your reports and segmentized it in 2 segments, the impact of conflict on children and also protecting children from grave violations. So first of all, you talked about the 6 grave violations, but before we get that, what's the impact of conflict on children according to your organization? Well, there's really, children are very much in the line of fire in the Northeast. The report focuses on 3 issues, but there are a number of actors contributing to violations against children, and it definitely doesn't encompass the full scope of issues that are happening in the Northeast at the moment. But the 3 issues that we focus on primarily are recruitment and use of children, which is somewhat unique because it touches on both sides of the conflict. So we have recruitment of children as young as 14 years old by Boko Haram. They were reported to participate in attacks, carry out surveillance. we also had reports of recruitment and use by civilian self-defense forces or militia that operate in the Northeast. These are groups that came about as a result, I think, of security voids in the Northeast, are very active at the moment, and we were able to document recruitment by those groups as well. The second issue that we look at in a lot of detail is attacks on schools, which is obviously a huge part of what's happening in the Northeast, and is fairly well documented already. What we were able to look at was kind of a trend from attacks on schools where schools were burned to situations where students and teachers themselves were directly attacked. Right. So we did, for example, a media survey that found that 414 at least students, teachers, and other civilians on school premises had been killed, injured, or abducted as a result of attacks on schools since January 2012. Okay. And then the last issue that we look at is abductions, which obviously is a big part of the conversation on Nigeria now, but at the time that we were looking at, we had a lot of reporting of it, but not a lot of information. So we spoke to girls between ages 15 and 22 who had been abducted and managed to escape, and we documented incidents as far back as December 2012, right up until the present. Unfortunately, abductions still continue to happen post-Chibok as well, so there have been a lot of raids on villages in Borno State and reports of mass abductions still taking place. We found that abductions happen from schools, local public transportation, raids on villages, and a number of the girls in particular who are abducted are subjected to rape and other forms of sexual violence in the camps.
I think it's also important for us to mention that when you went in for this 6-week research, that was from March to May, and you actually moved out just a week before the abductions of the mass abductions of the girls. Yeah. But okay, now you managed to interview 156 individuals, and some were through direct personal contact and some were over the phone. Can you briefly tell us how this was difficult for you to be able to reach out and dig all this information?
Sure. So I think the first issue, obviously, in Northeastern Nigeria and that a lot of people are facing is access. There's not a lot of access to some of the key areas. You can't fly in and out. Oftentimes you have to get to places like Borno State by road, and those roads are attacked often and very dangerous. So a lot of our research actually took place in areas surrounding. Nigeria has a very large internally displaced population. I think the last figure was about 650,000 people. Right. And as a result of that, you have a lot of people who've been affected by the violence, who have moved outside of those emergency areas, who we were able to talk to and to gather more information about their experiences. We also gathered information across the border in Niger, the Diffa region of Niger, where there's a huge number of Nigerian refugees that have been fleeing from Borno State since early last year. So that was definitely, you know, one of the challenges. I think that a lot of people are often very nervous to speak to, especially outsiders, about what's happening. Because these groups are so integrated into communities, I think people are very wary of what information they provide, what kind of repercussions they can have.
And to who they provide.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had to rely definitely on our local relationships and relationships with human rights defenders introducing us to victims of violations to get good quality information about what was happening.
So here you mentioned that there's over 650,000 people that have been displaced internally within Nigeria. So some of them obviously are the people that you managed to talk to. Can you tell us about this? I know that they are vigilantes, or what they call Vangora, and these are some of those people that are actually civilians, armed, who are recruiting young children to act as spies for you know, against the Boko Haram. Now, can you tell us exactly how this has been? I know you conducted some interviews, and there's some actually quotes that I wanted to read, if I can find them. But can you explain to us how that has been?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the Civilian Joint Task Force is a term that is used to, I think, encompass a wide range of civilian self-defense militia that operate in the Northeast. So in mid-2013, in Maiduguri, I think there was a feeling among the local populace that the Nigerian government hadn't done enough to ensure their safety and security, and it really led to civilians taking up arms themselves. And that was an initiative that was quite well welcomed. So the Borno State government has provided some assistance to these groups. The military has provided some assistance to these groups, recognizing that there are significant gaps in the security. We found that as Boko Haram has increasingly targeted civilian self-defense groups, their numbers have dwindled, and that has led to a situation where the recruitment is targeted at younger people and is more forced than perhaps it might have been in earlier stages.
And when you talk about younger people, what age groups are we looking at?
So the youngest that we were able to document was age 13. A member of the former member of the civilian JTF said that was the youngest that they had in their team of people, and they're expected to do things like carry out surveillance, patrols, identify potential members of Boko Haram, sometimes to participate in attacks. And I think what's most worrying about the involvement or affiliation of children with the Civilian Joint Task Force is because they are very deliberately attacked by Boko Haram. Any affiliation or association with the group puts children directly in the line of fire.
Okay, so their recruitment processes, how is this done? Do they just knock by, you know, any homestead and say, we want so-and-so, come with us? How are the parents going to respond to that kind of?
Yeah, so normally what happens is you have a representative from the group arrive in a village and negotiate with the village chief for representatives to join the group. So for basically any able-bodied member to become a part of the Civilian Joint Task Force. And any able-bodied member normally meant children up to or as young as 13 years old. And many people describe this process as being very much forced. There is an expectation that if you're a part of that community, you should be willing to take up arms in defense of your home and in your communities. And so you find a situation where children are being torn between either being a part of Boko Haram or now a part of the civilian self-defense groups that are operating in their areas.
So actually this is almost organized coming through the chief. The chief is the one who then establishes that at that homestead there's a 13-year-old boy who's capable of doing this kind of thing, and go and fetch him.
Yeah, and I think part of that also has to do with the impression that, you know, a boy of 13 or 14 years old is considered a man in those communities. And so there's an expectation that he should be able to take on those responsibilities.
Okay, so now tell me, you've spoken to a lot of people, including the girls, and some of them who have actually survived, you know, the clutches of this Boko Haram. What were their experiences like? I know there's been rape, there's been forced conversions from Christianity to Muslimhood. What were their experiences from the ones that you spoke to?
Yeah, well, I think girls in particular, when we look at abductions, girls and boys are abducted, but we look very specifically at girls, have suffered several layers of abuse, and I think you've touched on some of them. So most of them are brought into the camp. Christian girls are almost always forcibly converted. And in one case, for example, we had a girl talk about how she had a noose tied around her neck, and how she was dragged around the camp until she finally relented and said she was willing to convert. So that normally takes some period of time. And then along with other girls that are brought into those camps, they're often then forced into marriage with one of those members of Boko Haram. Or of whatever group has taken them. It's not always clear whether or not Boko Haram is in fact the group responsible for taking them. As you mentioned before, a number of the girls are raped while in custody. Sometimes it appears that the rape is targeted. So, for example, it is you know, they're selected girls that are selected for members to have relations with. Sometimes it's opportunistic. So it's a situation where you have a commanding officer stepping away and in that space or in that time, somebody taking advantage of a girl who's on her own. And I think perhaps what's most disturbing about this is when girls do finally escape, you know, the people that I spoke to were suffering immense psychological damage, sometimes physical abuse, but there aren't a lot of services available. And there's no way really to report the issue because there's such a mistrust of authorities and they're so overwhelmed with issues, there's just not a feeling that they can follow up on individual cases. Okay, so what you're describing to us is almost like a hopeless situation. We've been, obviously, after the girls disappeared, hearing reports that France, the United Kingdom, the United States have stepped in, and then some of the neighboring countries. What kind of assistance have they been giving to make this different, to make it less harsh, to make it better? Well, there's not that much information that's come forth. We definitely know that there are security arrangements in terms of being able to strengthen the security capacity and training for military actors, and in that kind of assistance and better at least being able to identify where the girls are. We do know also that a number of donor governments had provided funding for psychosocial support for the girls and their families. So that is definitely, there's been an outpouring of that kind of support from a number of different agencies. I think the one thing we would like to say is that while that is obviously a very important initiative, first and foremost, the girls are still missing. So there's a huge number of people still to address. And I think secondly as well, there are a number of other people who have suffered from grave violations and a number of other girls who don't have access to those same services. A lot of the money is very much targeted on just the Chibok girls and their families and hasn't been extended to other women and girls who have suffered equally heinous abuses.
Okay, so there's not really a steady or secure situation on the ground to help, you know, ease this pain. Now, if we have to go forward with this, you have government agencies that are already located on the ground that have already been doing some stuff. What have been the hindrances of them being able to, because you obviously talk about failure to cross over from a certain place by road. What kind of attacks are they fearing? What kind of situation do they?
It's definitely, we recognize how difficult it is for international and government agencies to operate in the Northeast. I think the biggest problem at the moment is the attacks are indiscriminate. So all civilians come under fire. It doesn't matter what ethnic group you're from, what religious group you're from. Civilians are targeted en masse. And because of the unpredictability of those attacks, it makes it very difficult for actors to know where they can operate without endangering their staff. That said, there haven't been any reports of targeted attacks of humanitarian agencies, for example, allowing them some access and capacity. You know, it's not, there are some organizations that operate in those areas. I think the other issue is that oftentimes, to the extent that there are actors involved in the Northeast, they are centered in urban hubs. So places like Maiduguri or places that are a bit more secure. So they're parts of the state that are completely devoid of any assistance. So there's no local government authority, all services have fallen apart, and there are areas where, for all intents and purposes, people are left to support themselves.
Okay, so what role can society then do besides creating these vigilante groups that are actually working against the children? What other means did you find that society could do? Because some would say, remove your kids, hide them somewhere, send them somewhere, or arm yourself.
Sure.
What response have you been seeing that society was deciding to take?
Yes, so I think it's obviously very complicated. One of the things, or one of the places we think a lot more could be done without the same kinds of level of security concerns, is at least support for people who are fleeing from the states of emergency.
Right.
So at the moment, Nigeria has a national IDP policy, internal displacement policy for people who have been displaced, but it hasn't in fact been implemented. And that's something we're really calling for, because we feel that, you know, children who are fleeing from those areas, family who are removing their children from those unsafe areas into surrounding hubs, really do need support from the government.
In terms of evacuating them,
and helping to reestablish them in other areas. At the moment, most people go to their extended family. And so there's this kind of impression that there is no internal displacement problem. But if you visit these families, these communities themselves are often incredibly stretched and don't have a lot of resources. And what we're really asking for is better support for those communities, both the hosts and for people fleeing across the border from the emergency states, because they're going to areas where there is much more capacity for support.
Okay, so from your own assessment, has this government, Nigerian government, grossly failed in terms of securing this kind of menace in that area?
I mean, I definitely think this is a situation that has been prolonged, and it is a situation that is escalating. So since 2009, I mean, just this year, there's been over 2,000 civilian deaths. So I think in terms of being able to ensure people's safety and security, there definitely have been some major failures. And even in the last couple of months, you've seen Boko Haram taking over entire territories, raising flags, issuing taxes, taking over parts of land. And that doesn't really speak well of the ability of the government to secure safety and security for for people.
For the people.
We are definitely asking them to be more open to international engagement and assistance, people who have experience in conflict areas, to allow for better humanitarian capacity and training to address some of these violations.
Okay, so you've just returned from the United Nations, where you sat down with the United Nations Security Council and obviously presented some of these issues. What were the major key points that are immediately necessary to take to try and quell that situation?
Sure. So we actually spoke to the Security Council Working Group, which is slightly different. They're a working group that focuses on children in armed conflict. But one of the things
Can you also mention the countries?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So there are 15, I'm not sure if I'm going to remember them all. There are 15 members of the Security Council at the moment. But perhaps most notably, Nigeria is on the Security Council at the moment. And so we were able to engage with them a little bit. I think what we've really pressed upon international actors is to really continue to put pressure on the government. First, in terms of the return of the Chibok girls, there's not a lot of information or updates for civilians about what's happened to those girls.
Right.
On September 11th, it'll be 150 days since the initial abduction, which is an immense amount of time, almost 5 months. And so I think continuing that pressure for action is important. The second place where we feel we can really have a lot of traction is around the issue of recruitment and use. This is a practice that has to be denounced publicly by the Nigerian government as well as international actors. Any form of support that it goes to civilian self-defense forces that recruit children has to be ceased.
Right.
And I think the Nigerian government...
This is in accordance with the United Nations.
Yes. Right. And I think with the support of international actors, the Nigerian government needs to develop a policy on how children who are encountered in conflict are handled. So at the moment, most of the time when children are found within the ranks of Boko Haram, for example, they are detained in military detention facilities, often incommunicado. And as child protection actors, we recognize that all children who are, for example, recruited are victims, and that there needs to be some sort of policy and procedure for those children to be transferred to humanitarian actors or other actors to help rehabilitate them, as opposed to the current policy of treating them as suspects and detaining them.
Okay, so now we know that this conflict is not about to end soon, and what's your next step since you've already presented this to the United Nations Security Council? Are you going to have a follow-up? Are you also going to go back to Nigeria to make further research? What's going to happen?
Absolutely. So we definitely plan to go back to Nigeria, where we spend 3 weeks, of course, talking to the most important actors, the government, as well as United Nations, humanitarian agencies, domestic NGOs. So we will be doing some training around grave violations to raise awareness of what these issues are. And we'll also be, of course, sharing the report, sharing those recommendations, and seeing where some potential action can be taken.
Okay. In fact, that was all for us today, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. And
this is obviously Miss Janine Morna. She's from WatchList, and she's actually the research officer over there, and responsible for the preparation of field monitors, and which aims to provide regular updates and policy advice to all those key policymakers. So stay tuned. We're going to keep following this story.